Okay, let's talk about your progress to this point in the term. You should, by this point, have a research question, a rough outline of your paper, and you should be reading everything you can get your hands on that is related to your topic. If you don't have one of these steps done, for instance, if you haven't settled on a research question yet, don't despair. Give me a call, send me an email, and I'll help you work through it. This week, you should be thinking about beginning your storyboard or some kind of basic organization for your paper. Remember that the key to helping other people understand what you've written is presenting the information you're finding in a logical order. The beginning exercise to learning how to write and do footnotes and format things in Turabian style is the article critique. It's due, this assignment is due at the end of this week, and this really is a mini research paper, so don't wait until the last minute to get started on it. The ways in which the article critique is a mini research paper is that you not only are critiquing the article you selected. Of course, I want you to do that. I want your opinion, but it needs to be an informed opinion. And if you look at the sample article critique, you'll see that it not only cites the information for the article itself, but also related authoritative sources. And so let's illustrate this graphically. Let's say here I have my own opinion of an article after I read it and study it. Then over here we have a known point, which is what a peer-reviewed paper that's related to my article says. Up here we have another peer-reviewed research paper that's related to the topic. And now I am giving my informed opinion on the paper. So it's not just my opinion in isolation. You need to know what other people are saying in the field. Now, the other sources that you cite for your critique don't have to be peer-reviewed. I'm just using that in the example here. It could also be government documents, for instance. If the author says that there are 350 million people in the United States, you can actually go to the Census Bureau and look up those facts for yourself and cite that in your paper. The important thing is that you're not just giving your opinion by yourself, that you're taking into account what other people in the field are saying about it. And that's the sense in which this really is a beginning research paper. I want at least 2 sources beyond the article you're citing. 4 or 5 or 6 would be better. Don't go so far that this comes out being longer than your final research paper, but I do want you to read and to understand more about your field. Part of this class is learning how to teach yourself about a topic. I think it's good to have a healthy skepticism concerning your sources. Remember that they are researchers trying to make sense of the data they've collected. And they're people. And so we use the word fact not very often in research, because I believe there is an absolute truth out there, but as human beings we can only understand that absolute truth imperfectly. And so no matter how many letters somebody has after their name, PhD, MD, whatever it is, remember they're still people. And research is a conversation that goes on. Someone writes a paper about a biblical text, or they do research, and then someone comes along because they got an idea from what the first researcher did, and they do something related to it. Or in social sciences, they might try to replicate an experiment to see if they find something similar, and they go back and forth. And one of the reasons we say that the limit on sources as it can't be more than 10 years old, at the bachelor's level at least, is that if you choose an article on business trends or marketing trends that was published 15 years ago, that conversation has gone cold. There are new trends in the industry. Our culture has changed, so you need to be more current than that. Theology is not quite as, ideas don't turn over as quickly in theology as they do in social sciences, but you still need to be current on what people are saying. The exception to that rule is something called a classic source, and if everyone you read is referring to something written in 1950, you need to be referring to it as well. It's probably a classic source, and to not do it would mean that you look uninformed. So if I see a couple of sources in your reference page that are older than 10 years, I'm just going to assume it's a classic source. So you're kind of on your honor there. Of course, if every one of your references on your reference page are from 1940, we're going to have a problem. Remember that when authors present their papers, that they are presenting their point of view on something, their interpretation. As human beings, we're limited. We don't have perfect things. Even geniuses don't have perfect thinking. And so publication, simply because it's published as a book or in a peer-reviewed journal, does not confer the status of truth. And notice there I have truth capitalized because I'm referring there to absolute truth. I want you to resist mindlessly falling into a researcher's pattern of thinking. I think everyone's had the experience of finding a paper and you think, well, this person said exactly what I want to say. I think I'll just adopt their outline and their argument. I don't want you to do that in this class. You are building the paper from the ground up. It's your show. And so if you find an article like that, I have done that too, one of the things I do is put it away until much later in the project, and then after I've developed my own outline, I come back to it. The important thing is what makes sense to you. When I was a graduate student, my PhD advisor asked me to read Vygotsky and Piaget and what they had written. Lev Vygotsky was the focus of my PhD research. They were both developmental psychologists in the early part of the 1900s. As I read articles, one of the things that the article said is that Vygotsky and Piaget were developmental psychologists who really fundamentally disagreed with each other about the way people develop. Vygotsky talked about the sociocultural theory of development, which simply says that a person develops based on the culture they live in, the language they speak, and those people who are closest to them. Piaget, on the other hand, talked about that human development is more of a biological process that we go through a maturing. And so people were saying, Vygotsky emphasizes the sociocultural aspect of it. Piaget emphasizes the biology of it, and they disagree with each other. However, when I actually read what Vygotsky and Piaget said, I found out that both of them said, I agree with the other guy, it's just that we emphasize different things. So who do you think knows whether they agree or not? The men themselves or people writing about them? And so I came to the conclusion that the people who were saying they fundamentally disagreed had not actually read the work of the men themselves. This is one of those things where you have to go to the original source. So you consciously choose to agree with something rather than just accepting what someone else says on faith. And when you do that, that constitutes the active consumption of research. Let's talk about focused reading. Susan Hubbock, who authored a book we used in this class in previous terms, said that focused reading is a deliberate process of seeking just the information that's needed. I don't know about you, but when I write a paper, sometimes I'll be in an online search engine and I'm looking for one thing, and then an hour later I'm reading about surfboards and wondering how I got there. But especially as adults, who have family obligations and a job and school too, it's very important that you are deliberate about doing your research, that you are focused, read with a purpose, don't get bogged down in reading something that has nothing to do with your research topic. For me, my motivation is normally my wife standing over me saying, okay, you need to speed this up. We have stuff to do. The kids have things to go to. So in focused reading, we're talking about being deliberate and learning about a subject by reading and then synthesizing and analyzing what you found. And that synthesizing and analyzing is actually looking at a source and then thinking about, how does this fit into my outline? You should be doing that with each source you read. And staying organized is a key to that. Whatever method you use, Zotero, EndNote, my old Beautiful Mind method, whatever it is, staying organized is a key. Remember, to keep you focused, consider your research question as you read. And when I do research, I like to keep my research question so I can see it, because if I can't see it, I forget about it, and I tend to stray off the point. Here are some things that you need to think about. Does my initial research question still seem right? And it says, I'm accumulating new information, I'm learning more about the fine points of my research question, does it still seem right? If it is changing, why is it changing? And this is a good time of the term, it's not too late to consider a change in direction. If you decide to do that, please contact me and we'll work through it. The important thing is to look for information that helps you answer your research question. So your filter is the research question. This is a real key to being deliberate in doing research. And you approach sources with these questions. What do I need from this source? And what's the most efficient way to get the information? Adobe documents, lots of online documents, just about anything online you can use a find feature. I would encourage you to do that. You have keywords you're looking for, you have outline points. Use those search tools. What you don't want to do is spend an hour or two reading something that is an Adobe document when you could have gotten to the information in 2 or 3 minutes with the Finder. So use that. That's very important. If you're looking at a hard copy book, look at the index. If you're looking at a peer-reviewed article, always read the abstract first. That will give you a hint of if there's anything in the source that you need to inform either your research question or your outline. Another thing to consider is the type of source you're looking at. We already talked about the abstract, which is important just to scan that to see if it relates to your research question. Another is the date published. In other words, is it a part of the current conversation going on in your field? And this is just a 10-year rule again. None of the sources you cite should be older than 10 years unless you're doing a theology topic or a history topic. And in that case, of course, you must talk about not only the original sources. For this class, a major original source would be the Bible, but also what people were writing about this pieces of literature or that period of history or the Bible years ago, but you also need to be current on what's going on now. What's the current conversation about your topic? Classic sources, I mentioned this a little bit, but one of the things you can do is if you do a Google Scholar search for your article, it'll show you something our library database does not, which is how many other articles or sources cite it. If you are looking at an article, you're wondering if it's central to your field of study, you go into Google Scholar, and it shows that it is cited by 10,000 other people. That tells you it should probably be on your reference page too. Well, that's a good way to judge whether it's a classic source or not. When you read, one of the things I like to do is always have a pen or pencil, or ideally something like a laptop or a pad, so I can take notes as I go. There are some people who say that you should read a source and then read it again, and the second time make notes. But I don't have time to do that with all the obligations I have, so I never read something that I'm going to do a research paper on unless I have my laptop with me so I can take notes as I go. Now, the disadvantage of doing it with a pencil is that eventually I'll have to type it again, and that takes more time. Whereas if I type it at the beginning, I don't have to worry about it. It's also, if you summarize and paraphrase as you go along, it will help you avoid simply copying and pasting exact words and having to try to put everything in your own words at the end of the term. You do the work as you go along. As you read articles, think about what does the author say about agreement or disagreement with other theories. Maybe you're talking about Calvinism versus Arminianism, or what camp could you put that person in as you read it? Could you put them in any specific school or approach? I think one of you is doing some work on the book of Revelation and eschatology. So one of the things you need to think about is this person a covenantal theologian, dispensational, are they Christological? What would you place them in? And then what does the researcher or the author tell you about his or her research methods? This is a little more transparent in theological or philosophical research, but in social sciences it's very important that researchers tell you enough about their study or their experiment that you could come along and replicate it. So their obligation is to give enough detail that someone could come along who doesn't know them and replicate their study. Sometimes you run into difficult material, people that has very specialized terms. Sometimes feels like systematic theology or, well, virtually any academic field, you can get into very specialized terms very quickly. It's good to have a specialized dictionary bookmarked on your computer so you can go and look up those difficult terms. Part of this class is learning how to teach yourself. It's also good when you run into difficult material, besides building a vocabulary, is to actively summarize and paraphrase as you go. To think about, how could I put that in my own words? Look at it as like a playful way. And then reread it to be certain that you know what the author is saying. And this is particularly important in legal and philosophical research, because sometimes in those two fields, occasionally there's no other way to word it in the English language, and if you reword it, you've actually changed the meaning. So be careful, especially in those two fields. Always look up difficult terms in a specialized dictionary, not a general dictionary, because a dictionary of systematic theology is always going to give you a lot more specific definition than a general dictionary will. Another good thing to do is just to let the source cool off. Put it aside and come back to it a day or two later. Of course, that means you have to start reading enough ahead of time that you have the luxury of putting it aside and coming back to it later. I want you to look at Rule 7.9 in the Turabian Guide, and we're going to engage this week regarding paraphrases. And a lot of people do what is called a poor man's paraphrase or illegitimate paraphrase, where they change one or two words, but really the quote is still mostly intact. So if you're going to paraphrase a portion of an article, read the passage and put it aside. What I do is I turn it over so I can't see it. And unless you have a photographic memory, you're not going to be able to reproduce the exact words if you can't see it. So that helps to put it in your own words. Then think about what the author is saying and write it in your own words, and then reread the original passage. Remember, if you're doing paraphrases, summaries, or anything in this endeavor, you need to be looking at how does this address your research question and the major points of your outline. And that'll give you a clue as to what kinds of things you need to be paraphrasing. In other words, if you come up to a one-page passage, if you're looking at the point you're trying to make and you're paraphrasing it, you're probably not going to paraphrase each sentence. You don't need to, because you're only paraphrasing part of it, because it's for the purposes of your research. Occasionally it is appropriate to quote an author. If you're going to do that, think about which of the author's words are important enough to quote. A caution here. In a paper of the length you're writing in this class, you should not have any block quotes, that is, those that go 5 or more lines. If you're going to use a quote, also think about how does it fit into my argument, that is, my research question and my outline. Occasionally in sermons or in convincing speeches, the speaker will read a poem at the end and then just leave the audience to figure out what it means. Not so in doing an analytic research paper. What I want you to do is tell me why the quote is there, either before or after it appears. One more thing on quotes is that your paper should be no more than 10% direct quotes. More than that says to your professor that you are mentally lazy. Part of paraphrasing and summarizing or taking an idea from a source and citing it is that that information has been through the filter of your brain. The very worst situation I got into was a graduate student who turned in a paper with almost 70% quotes. She said almost nothing. It was just one quote after another. And I called to ask her what happened and why she put so many quotes. And she said, well, I didn't really understand some of the quotes, so I thought if I just put them all on the paper, maybe you could understand them. That's the wrong answer. Orderly presentation of ideas. It's one thing for you to read your paper and be able to understand it. It's another thing for someone else to be able to understand it. So present your ideas in a logical order. Sometimes another pair of eyes helps. I have found through the years that if I ask my wife to critique my writing, or the other way around, it always ends up in a huge fight. So I don't want to cause any kind of domestic disharmony or domestic conflict. And so you may need to get someone outside your marriage to look at this. So present your ideas in a logical order. Another pair of eyes can help you figure that out. And remember that effective organization of ideas entails more than composing a good outline. This is where the work of writing and revision comes in. And I'm not a good writer the first time through. It normally takes 4 or 5 major revisions before my writing is ready for the world. Paragraph structure is also important. Each paragraph should have a topic sentence. Think about each of the research claims you want to present. That normally needs to be the first sentence in the paragraph. It's kind of almost subconscious, but if you see a paper that doesn't have paragraph divisions, it kind of helps you get, it kind of causes you to get lost. Paragraph divisions really give a good visual clue that you are moving from one major idea to the next, or maybe a minor idea. And if they're not there, you notice. Remember that a paragraph should not run more than the length of one double-spaced page. Economy of expression is talked about in Chapter 11, but in general, avoid using a lot of jargon or wordiness. Jargon will alienate your readers very quickly because we may not be familiarized with specialized terms. Wordiness just makes a paper hard to read. One of the resources I have in the folder this week I want you to look at, I call it the Percocet paper, because the student who wrote it had a compound fracture in his leg. He was trying to get through it with a lot of pain, trying to write his paper, and he was on some pretty heavy medication, actually Percocet. And I want you to look at this paper. It's kind of funny because he thought it was really profound, but in a research paper he didn't actually cite any sources, so that's a problem. The other is that it's a good example of word magic, because although he uses many lofty terms, he really doesn't say much, and he could probably express all the ideas from this little piece I pulled out of his paper in a sentence or two. It's kind of funny because I read the first 4 or 5 pages, and in those 4 or 5 pages I think he used the word mandate about 50 times. When I found out his situation and his health issues, I allowed him to rewrite the paper, and he did much better sober. I guess the rule there is if you aren't legal to drive, you shouldn't be doing research either. There are more really good writing tips in Turabian in chapters 7, 9, 10, and 11. These chapters aren't long. It will benefit you greatly to read them. I recommend that you do that. I'm going to take a moment to walk you through the exercises for this week. So I'm just going to begin by going into assignments and this week's folder. There are, besides the lecture here, there are two subfolders. One is for writing the article critique, so let's go into that. First document you see here are the guidelines for writing a critique. And here you will see that for each section it gives you what you're supposed to be doing. It's a little bigger on the screen. With my email here, you can send me for approval of your article. I need to be sure that you know how to retrieve a peer-reviewed journal article and that it does present some kind of research. In writing your critique, you're going to be introducing the article under consideration and the authors, talking about the study's key findings, providing background materials to help your reader understand the research in the paper. Now, this is important because this is a section where you can cite related sources. From the lecture I talked about giving your informed opinion. This is a good place to do that, to talk about what other people in the field are saying about related things. Then summarize the article's methods, results section, and key findings. And finally, but assessing the research paper. Is the information accurate? Now this is important because you can't really say whether an article is giving an accurate conclusion or seems accurate unless you have a good feel for what else is being written in that field. In other words, this needs to be substantiated for more than just your own opinion. The second question is related to it. Is the information significant? You can only give a substantial answer to that question if you've looked at what other research in the same area to see if this paper seems to pass the so what test. Now, you can assume that since it passed the peer review process, it must have some significance, but I'd like you to address that a little bit. And then, has the author interpreted information fairly? This is especially true if your article is on some kind of controversial topic. Similarities or differences to other published research. If it's social science, were there any kind of confounding variables that the researcher failed to take into account? This may not be an issue for theological or philosophical research. That one really only applies to social sciences. Then respond to the presentation. This is your view of it. And then finally, conclude. Another thing I have in this folder is an actual sample article critique written by a student in this class a few terms ago. Her name is Kelly Walker. She is actually a real person. And this is her critique. And you can see that she goes through each step here. You can see, for instance, here in the introduction, she begins with reportedly record numbers of people are imprisoned for an increasing range of offenses that are being punished by varying harsh methods. And then down here she's citing James Q. Whitman, Harsh Justice. That is a book published by Oxford University Press. That is not the article she is critiquing. And then she quotes another one down here. He faults Christian churches for at least part of the recent increase in harshness, pointing to their ability to wield political power on the issue. And so you you see how she is weaving together both her opinion and what others have done. So take a look at this example article. I think it will help you in understanding. A common mistake students make in doing the critique is forgetting to list the publishing information for the article that they are actually critiquing. You see her article, the full information is here. I need to see that on your critique. And here are the other two citations she's using. Now she has done the minimum. You could do 3 or 4 or 5 that would make me happy, but the minimum requirement is at least 2 other sources that inform or are related to the article that you are critiquing. Let's go back to the assignment folder. I also have a section, a subfolder here on wordiness. The first one is called Needless Words. This gives examples of redundancy, useless phrases. So for instance, here you have the redundant version, 12 midnight, the lean version, midnight. By the way, there is no such thing as 12 a.m. and p.m. There is 12 noon and 12 midnight. But if you say 12, you don't need to say 12 noon. All you need to say is noon. 3 a.m. in the morning. Well, 3 a.m. is 3 a.m. It is in the morning. You don't need to say it. Down here, some more completely unanimous. Is there another way to be unanimous? Or consensus of opinion. It's just consensus. And I have made all of these mistakes, and maybe you have too, so you're not alone. Some more down here. There is no doubt but that. No doubt. The future to come. Well, if it's to come, it's the future. Further down, it gives examples of needless phrases like all things considered. All things considered, Connecticut's woodlands are in better shape now than ever before. You could actually omit that phrase and just say Connecticut's woodlands are in better shape now than ever before and not lose any core meaning. So this list gives all the unnecessary phrases, so take a look at those as well. Cliches to avoid: acid test, at loose ends, babe in the woods. I like this one: blind as a bat, flat as a pancake, ladder of success, worth its weight in gold. Avoid these in writing. This is especially important in formal writing to stay away from these. If you ever have occasion to work with people who are English as a second language, they will not understand these, so don't use them. Finally, in this we have the sentences I've given you to revise, and these are contrived. I tried to screw them up as much as possible. What I want you to do is to revise these so that you preserve the core meaning, but there are no extra words left, and there's a forum for you to post your responses to these. There's a description here of the Percocet paper, but this is a student who actually somehow fell through the rungs of a ladder, and then his upper body fell, his legs were sticking through the rungs, and it snapped his femur, and they found him hanging there. He was trying to be a good student and finish his paper on time. Unfortunately, he had to be on some pretty heavy pain meds to get that done, and it showed in his writing. So the lesson here is that if you aren't legal to drive, you probably shouldn't be writing a research paper either. The interesting thing about this paper is that this is just a little piece of it. In the first 3 or 4 pages, he used the word mandate about 50 times, and it's a research paper, and there were no references, which is a real problem. By the way, I allowed him to rewrite it when I found out about his leg being broken. So I want you to rewrite this one in 1 or 2 concise sentences. I think you could probably express what he did in 2 paragraphs in 2 sentences. And finally, there is the discussion board for this week. And here are the needless words handout where you revise the sentences. This one is revising the Percocet paper. This last one, Trabian Section 7.9 is the one that goes over guarding against plagiarism, illegitimate paraphrase. This is really important, so I want you to read that carefully so you don't get in trouble. Let me back out one more time. Go back to assignments and back into this week. If we go into the article critique, the very last link down here is where you submit that. Your article critique is due by April 2nd, midnight. If you've not submitted your peer-reviewed article for me to approve, please do that. This is a fail-safe, so if you wind up making a mistake and critiquing something from the National Enquirer, I hope you wouldn't do that by this point in the course, but if you did, you would get a 0 on the assignment. So this is a fail-safe to be sure that the one you critique is actually what you're supposed to be doing. As always, email me or call me if you have questions. Don't be shy about doing that, and I'll look forward to interacting with you in the discussion board this week.